Genetically Modified Skeptic is a popular YouTube channel run by an atheist named Drew McCoy. Now, Drew's channel has grown pretty popular as of late, as he's somewhere around 190,000 subscribers right now. And in this video, I'll be responding to his latest video in which he consistently calls Frank Turek dishonest multiple times. Now, this video will be the first in a short series of videos responding to his recent video in which I show exactly why not only has Drew not only misunderstood the basics of the fine-tuning argument, but that caused him to also misunderstand Turek's remarks, and even worse, based an entire assault on Turek's character based off of those misunderstandings. So the description of his video says this: Frank Turek, cross-examined on YouTube, is a Christian apologist who recycles old-tired apologetics like William Paley's watchmaker analogy and the teleological argument when his views are challenged. Here, Turek goes up against Douglas Adams' puddle analogy as a response to claims of intelligent design. Frank thinks DNA is a code or message made by God, and there's no other explanation for it. The issue is, Turek is unfamiliar with the basics of evolution and how DNA evolves. Here we will see apologetics fired out in a rapid patter, creating a concise piece of Christian propaganda. I'm here to debunk it. Yeah. None of that could actually be more wrong. And I don't mean that hyperbolically. Literally, just about all of it is wrong. We'll be going through his entire video, but here are some quick clips of what Drew thinks about Turek and Christian apologists.
Turek is a professional apologist, and in my opinion, he represents his ilk very well. He's articulate, charismatic, rather ignorant of basic science, and above all, loyal to defending his narrative regardless of what dishonesty that necessitates. Honesty is not exactly easy for Turek. Now, I highly doubt that Turek is actually unintelligent enough to not understand the puddle analogy, so that leaves the other possibility that Turek is dishonest. Still, this guy, once again, is too dense to understand this hypocrisy or is too dishonest to recognize it, and I don't think he's too dense. This is so manipulative of his impressionable audience. It's gross. You just don't know that because you're scientifically illiterate. Because as we've seen here, honesty is not his strong suit.
Now, personally, I don't mind a little bit of snarkiness, but if you're gonna make a video that hundreds of thousands of people will see and literally inform everyone that another person is a bald-faced liar, then you'd better have your facts in order. That's all I'm saying. Now, I know that people make mistakes, and I'm willing to grant that Drew made some really big mistakes here, but that same degree of charity should be extended both ways. I never start off assuming that people are being intentionally dishonest, but instead that they could be confused themselves, lazy, or just flat out wrong. But that's just me. Anyways, in the video, Drew's responding to Frank Turek's response to an objection to the fine-tuning argument. I won't rehash the argument here, so if you're not familiar with the argument, I put a link in the description to an animation video that will give you the basic rundown of the argument in just a few minutes. If you're not familiar with the argument, then I would highly recommend that you watch that video first so that way we're all on the same page. Now, I want to be clear that my goal here is not to argue for the fine-tuning argument in this video, but instead my goal is simply to correct Drew's misunderstanding of it and show his basic misunderstandings of the fine-tuning argument, the argument from intelligent design, and his appeals to fallacies are all severely mistaken. I ordinarily wouldn't care so much as people make mistakes, but as you will see, because he went through such lengths to attack somebody else's character and paint all apologists as liars, I think his video warrants all of what he's got coming. So that's what we're going to get into today. Are you guys ready to get into it? Then let's go!
You can't make any puddle argument for that.
I came across a clip on Christian Apologist Frank Turek's YouTube channel recently, and it impressed me. Not with how well done it was, but with how many fallacies and misdirections it contained in just 3 minutes. It's a work of mastery, really.
I hate to stop the video already, but as we will come to see, Genetically Modified Skeptic didn't just get quite literally every single accusation of fallacies wrong in his video, but he also misunderstands the basic of the argument and the response. That's what's really amazing, but we'll get to that soon enough.
Turek is a professional apologist, and in my opinion, he represents his ilk very well. He's articulate, charismatic, rather ignorant of basic science, and above all, loyal to defending his narrative regardless of what dishonesty that necessitates.
What really gets me about people like this is that they can be so fast to call other people dishonest, and they usually do so out of ignorance and a lack of understanding. I even see atheists doing this to each other when they get criticism from fellow atheists. Richard Carrier has done this, as far as I know, with every single person, atheist or not, who's criticized his work, like he did with Bart Ehrman. Aaron Raw did this with Steve McRae, and so on. Calling people dishonest and calling them liars is sadly expected from some of these guys. If you've been following my videos for some time, you'll notice that I haven't ever called anyone dishonest. I would be very slow to call someone dishonest because I see how easy it is for someone to be sincerely wrong, or that they just misunderstand, or they don't know what you know, or cognitive dissonance, or whatever. I wouldn't call them being intentionally dishonest. I would just say that they're wrong. But most of these popular atheist channels grow because they get people to feel negative emotions towards Christians or God. But we'll talk about that again some other time, so let's just keep it moving.
This clip revolves around what Turek thinks of Douglas Adams' puddle analogy as a response to arguments for intelligent design like the teleological argument. Eventually, Turek poses a question and says that if atheists can answer it, it'll do away with his own argument for good. If you don't know what the puddle analogy is, don't worry, we'll get to that. For context though, let's play a little bit of the clip first.
Sometimes I run into this question or this argument against the teleological argument, which would be the puddle argument.
Yeah.
Which claims that the teleological argument, even though it has specifications that ultimately lead up to human life, it seems that through the puddle argument, it's more like it's just an appeal to pathos than it really is to any
All right, explain what you mean by the puddle argument.
To be clear, this guy doesn't explain the puddle analogy well. It's also hard to tell whether he's saying that the puddle analogy implies that teleological argument is an appeal to pathos or emotion, or that the puddle analogy itself is an appeal to pathos. I'll explain my thoughts on both ideas with one statement. I don't think the puddle analogy implies that about the teleological argument or appeals to pathos itself. It simply proposes another possible solution to the question of why our environment suits us and appears finely tuned for us. We'll get to a full explanation of the analogy, hang with me. I just want you to hear Turek's explanation and Douglas Adams' explanation side by side.
Well, I think if I understand the puddle argument, they're saying that the reason there's a puddle there is there's a hole in the ground and it's filled with water, and that's just the way it is, and we're kind of the same way.
Yeah, so Turek explained this pretty poorly, already essentially misrepresenting the analogy as simplistic and thoughtless.
And now we get to the good stuff. So Drew accuses Turek of misrepresenting the objection as simplistic and thoughtless, but it shouldn't have seemed that way to me. Instead, it seems clear that he was only clarifying that he understood the guy's question correctly, since, as Drew himself even pointed out, the guy's question seems a little confused. Turek wasn't trying to teach people the objection, but making sure he understood the questioner's objection correctly. But it seems that Drew has taken the most uncharitable understanding of Turek as possible. And this works well since in his video he routinely calls Turek dishonest. Interpreting that as Turek being willfully deceitful seems to me to be disingenuous. Also, that wasn't all that Turek said about it, so I'm not sure why Drew put a break there, but here's the full clip.
The reason there's a puddle there is there's a hole in the ground and it's filled with water, and that's just the way it is, and we're kind of the same way. It's kind of like what we're doing is we see a target, we see an arrow in the wall, and we go up and draw a bullseye around it.
Yeah.
Let's keep it going.
There's much more to be said of the analogy than Turek allows, so here's Douglas Adams delivering it himself.
A puddle wakes up one morning and thinks, this is a very interesting world I find myself in. It fits me very neatly. In fact, it fits me so neatly, I mean, really precise, isn't it? It must have been made to have me in it.
Pretty different when explained properly, huh?
No, not really at all.
It would have been respectable if Turek actually correctly represented the analogy, but as you'll see, honesty is not exactly easy for Turek.
And now he shows the other clip that we just saw.
It's kind of like what we're doing is we see a target, we see an arrow in the wall, and we go up and draw a bullseye around it.
Yeah.
Actually, yes, I would say that's a good way to describe what Turek and the intelligent design crowd do. As he continues, I think you'll see why.
Okay, well, I don't think that works for a number of reasons. One reason, obviously, is the universe had a beginning, and secondly, a fine-tuned beginning. And you can't make any puddle argument for that, because nothing exists until the universe exists, nothing made of molecules anyway, and it's precisely fine-tuned. If it were changed any way, slightly, any one of those factors, slightly, nothing would exist or nothing livable would exist.
So what Turek did here is just say, that's not what I'm doing, and then just restate the teleological argument. He doesn't even contend with the puddle analogy. In case you're wondering, the statement that the universe had a beginning or that the nature of the cosmos is such that it allows for life as we know it to exist is no problem for the puddle analogy. The analogy just shifts perspectives, presenting the possibility that the universe existed first and that we, in our evolution, came to exist as a creature which fits its pre-existing environment.
The problem here is that Turek did respond to it, and Genetically Modified Skeptic just doesn't understand the argument well enough to understand Turek's response to the argument, as we'll see just in a moment.
Very simply put, it entertains the thought that we are a result of adaptation to our environment, rather than asserting that the environment was built specifically to accommodate the capabilities and limitations of humans. Given that the fossil record demonstrates that modern humans have been around for a couple 100,000 years at most, and radiometric dating of ancient rock formations like zircon crystals show Earth to be over 4 billion years old, I think it's worth entertaining the idea that we adapted to what was already here.
This really helps to demonstrate again how it's because he doesn't seem to understand the fine-tuning argument correctly that he failed to get Turek's response. The fine-tuning argument is not about perspective or adaptation, so changing perspective doesn't actually say anything in response to the argument. The argument's about the initial conditions of the universe that was needed for life. Drew expands on this idea by claiming that rather than the universe being created for us to live, we adapted to the universe. But him saying this misses the point of the argument. Yes, life adapted to the universe, but that's because of the initial conditions being the way they were in the beginning of the universe. Those conditions are the conditions that, if they were altered by an incomprehensibly small degree, there would be no life anywhere in the universe. Those initial conditions are what the argument's all about, and they're the crux of the argument. So to restate the issue, the fine-tuning argument is not about life adapting to the universe or what life can adapt to, but instead the argument is about the initial conditions that it would take to allow any life to be able to exist or evolve in the first place.
Getting back to Turek, it's pretty obvious that he's heard all this before, so what I have to conclude is that Turek has either heard this repeatedly and still doesn't understand it, or that he understands this argument, can't properly refute it, and chooses to restate his previous argument in hopes of distracting everyone away from the point he can't refute. Now, I highly doubt that Turek is actually unintelligent enough to not understand the puddle analogy, so that leaves the other possibility that Turek is dishonest.
Or perhaps option 4, being that you didn't understand his response because you had an apparent failed understanding of the argument in the first place. If Drew did understand the argument correctly, then he probably would have had more context to understand the point that Turek was making.
Okay, so there appears to be intelligence behind the universe.
Turek can state this all he wants, but the universe's intuitive appearance to anyone means nothing until they can demonstrate that there is intelligence behind the universe. Again, Turek just restates a talking point that doesn't contend with the puddle analogy because he can't contend with the puddle analogy.
A little ironic, wouldn't you say?
The analogy directly acknowledges that the universe appears designed, and it poses an explanation for why that appearance is deceiving.
Secondly, the genome that we mentioned earlier, the 3.2 billion letter genome, is like a software program.
You could compare genetic sequences to binary code. Sure, there are certainly similarities there. Does that demonstrate that there is intelligence behind genetic sequences, though? No. This point is intuitive, and that may be convincing to some, but it ultimately proves nothing. Show me the supernatural design process of its creation. Show me its creator directly. If you can't, asserting that it was designed is unjustifiable.
Okay, lots of problems with that. I'll be responding to his comments about genetic sequencing and binary code later, but consider his point that we first have to see the process or the designer before we can infer design. Now, I just like to point out that if the world were to accept his logic here, then archaeologists everywhere would be out of a job. Could you imagine being an archaeologist and stumbling on some ancient pottery and reasonably concluding that there must have been an ancient civilization that probably designed the pottery, only to hear Drew say,
"Show me its creator directly." If you can't, asserting that it was designed is unjustifiable.
Or if we found some machinery on the side of the moon?
Show me its creator directly. If you can't, asserting that it was designed is unjustifiable.
Or tell that to SETI, who actually understands the distinction between intentional and unintentional design.
Show me its creator directly.
Looks like they're out of a job too. Now, countless examples could be given, and if you can think of one, go ahead and write yours down below. Not to mention that this reasoning would destroy science's way to use inference to the best explanation, since there's countless things that are affirmed not because we see the thing or we understand the process all the way, but because we see its effects or because it best explains the observable data. Now, we're going to get to the rest of his video, but it's worth noting that Drew posted the following in his comment section on the video. He says, "Do you think Turek is being dishonest? Does he understand the arguments against intelligent design? I voiced my opinion, but I'm still a bit conflicted." Really? If he were truly conflicted, then why not be sure before you go out your way to convince literally hundreds of thousands of people that Frank Turek is a liar? I mean, if you're just not sure, wouldn't it be wise to tread just a little bit more carefully? Yeah, you tell me. Well, that does it for part 1, and I simply can't wait for part 2. If you're as excited as I am, and this is your first time here, make sure you hit the subscribe button so that way you don't miss it. But next time that you hear Genetically Modified Skeptics saying,
"This is so manipulative of his impressionable audience. It's gross. You just don't know that because you're scientifically illiterate. Because as we've seen here, honesty is not his strong suit."
what are you going to say?
What do you mean?